speaking of that issue of opposition and how it's growing in pretty much all sectors of society here in the United States, we want to turn to the issue of the U.S. labor movement in solidarity with Palestine. And we are very, very honored to be joined here for this conversation by Nastaran Mohit, who is the organizing director of the NewsGuild here in New York and also a member of U.S. Labor Against Racism and War. Nastaran, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's really an honor to have you. And as I was mentioning, we're seeing so much happen in so many different sectors all around the country in solidarity with Palestine. Talk to us a little bit about what we've seen so far in the U.S. labor movement.
Sure. So I think what we're seeing across the labor movement is a very similar dynamic that we're witnessing across the U.S., where we know and we are seeing that thousands upon thousands of rank and file workers across this country, when they see and hear and learn about what is happening in Palestine, they are horrified. And they are seeing, whether they're following the mainstream media or not, they are seeing on social media the brutality of what is happening. And they are seeing thousands of people come to the streets. And there is certainly a shifting climate across our labor spaces, not only in the form of resolution after resolution calling for a ceasefire, but really just a much deeper conversation about the state of Israel and what Zionism is and what the occupation of Palestine actually means. And so similarly, we are seeing if not a complete silence from labor leadership, but full and unequivocal support from some U.S. labor leaders for the state of Israel, which has been the status quo in the labor movement for decades. Labor Zionism is a very strong force within the movement. There's a very long history, which I won't go into detail here. Folks can certainly Google it and check it out themselves. But it's an important history to understand why there has been so much silence and complicity from the labor movement. And so we are seeing a real seismic shift across the labor movement. And you're seeing every day a new resolution passed calling for a ceasefire. But what you're also seeing is that the language, even just a few weeks ago, when some of the initial statements started to trickle out calling for a ceasefire, you're starting to see some of these statements, the language in these statements really strengthen and really acknowledge the brutality and barbarism of this genocide unfolding before our eyes, and calling for a boycott and divestment and sanctioning of the state of Israel, a call to stop arming Israel, which is the call that has been made of us by the Palestinian trade unions. They put out a call on October 16th asking for unions across the world to stop arming Israel, to stop transporting arms to the state of Israel, to stop military research, to pass resolutions within their unions. So we are, as a U.S. labor movement, in consideration of that call that has been made of us by the Palestinian labor movement, the call for a ceasefire is the absolute bare minimum that we can be putting forth. But we also know, as organizers within the labor movement, that we do have to meet people where they are, and we have to start these conversations somewhere. So if it starts around a call for ceasefire, we know that is a starting point, right? We want to appeal to folks' real deep humanity, that we want the bombs to stop dropping on Gaza, but we also use that as a starting point to have a deeper conversation about what it means to be funding this genocide, where our tax dollars are going, and really to educate further on the occupation of Palestine.
No, I think that's all so important. And you mentioned the issue of, yes, rank and file workers are, talking about Gaza, and you have, certain resolutions being passed. And I imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine there's a divide from the maybe bigger unions in terms of the people who run them, as there has been in the past. Has that been the case this time around? And how is that being dealt with? Like, I know when it comes to, for example, the American Federation of Teachers, there's been I know ongoing controversies over the years of the leadership going on these visits, these propaganda tours to Israel. I assume maybe the AFL-CIO leadership might be doing the same thing. I'm not entirely sure. But, Israel does do a good job of co-opting the leaders of really, really big institutions on these like propaganda trips to Israel. And of course, that's not exactly with what rank and file workers might be supporting. So can you maybe talk a bit about that divide and how it's being handled?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the UFT is a perfect example. The AFT, actually just yesterday, the AFT chapter here in New York City just shot down a ceasefire resolution. And you compare that to the Chicago Teachers Union, which passed, I think it was about a week and a half ago, passed a ceasefire resolution. I think this really underscores, the conversations are happening across the working class, right? Whether you're represented by a union or not, but certainly within our union halls, rank and file members, whether they be teachers or Teamsters or nurses who are looking at the bombs raining down on every hospital in Gaza, they are having these conversations, and many times they're coming to their leadership and saying, why are we staying silent on this? In the same way that Americans across the country are coming to their senators and their Congress members and they're saying, why are we not calling for a ceasefire? So we're seeing a lot of those same dynamics. And so leadership has to hear from the rank and file, and they are hearing from the rank and file. But I think this is where it goes back to, again, leadership having there are very, very strong connections between many of our unions and the state of Israel. And that is what we're chipping away at. I think it's incredibly important to highlight the hypocrisy of the AFL-CIO in saying that we are not taking a stand on this issue and actively silencing labor federations from putting out statements, which they did several weeks ago when a state fed in Olympia, Washington put out, a pro-ceasefire statement, and they were asked to take it down immediately. And you contrast that to the AFL-CIO's position on Ukraine. And you contrast that to the many unions that put out statements denouncing the aggression of Russia and extending solidarity to the working class of Ukraine, changing their Twitter profiles to the Ukrainian flag, holding panels and forums on the crisis in Ukraine. And just a few years later, at complete silence on a genocide that is unfolding before our eyes. So the contrast could not be more stark. This is not an issue of whether labor leaders can speak out on this issue. It is a complete lack of courage and morality in the face of injustice. And so if labor leaders are not going to speak out about the genocide in Gaza and the occupation of Palestine, then they need to feel the pressure from the rank and file. And so that's the purpose we certainly feel we are serving right now at U.S. Labor Against Racism and War, in that we're trying to convene as many rank and file workers as possible across the country, connecting with our union siblings across the world on this issue, to really push from the bottom up so that union leadership has no choice but to take a stand on this issue in the same way that our elected officials have to feel the pressure from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Well, one other issue I want to touch here that, I just am thinking about in this conversation is especially speaking about people speaking out is, in some ways the importance of being organized on the job. I think that when we look at issues like this, major controversies and crises, this is something that people fear, right? Like if I say something, this could happen to me or that could happen to me in terms of my employment, in terms of other things. And I was hoping you could speak to that aspect of it as well, because it also makes me think about the importance of unions in general in protecting our actual rights to be able to say what we feel in these kind of moments.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have, this is now, I think, day 41, right, since the assault began. And what we've seen over the last few weeks, as I'm sure many of you have heard, has been, the only comparable, I think, scenario was post 9/11 in terms of the climate, the McCarthyite environment we are all witnessing, where There has been a suppression of voices, a silencing of voices, the targeted harassment, doxing, and retaliation against people in their workplaces. So we have heard from doctors, nurses, academic workers, journalists across so many industries and so many workplaces where simply liking a post on social media has led to termination. Simply calling for a ceasefire has led to termination. So certainly within this context, union representation is critical, just for workers to know their rights, and to know, just even to be able to call in a union steward in a meeting where, a manager pulls you in and says, hey, I saw so-and-so on your social media account. Can we talk about this? But aside from just individual rights as workers, we know that our real power rests in our numbers, right? So in any workplace, coming together with your colleagues, finding other coworkers, talking to them about these issues. A lot of working people want to say something about this, but they feel alone and isolated. And that's really our job as organizers, is to find other people in our workplace and say, do you see what is happening in Gaza? We're paying for that with our tax dollars. When we're suffering as a U.S. working class, they never have any money for our schools and our roads and our hospitals, but they always have money for war. So getting together other like-minded folks in your workplace, that is where the real power is. But certainly a big piece of the work that we've been doing is really just educating workers on what their rights are. If they have a union in their workplace, knowing when to, invoke their wine garden rights, right? Their right to have a steward in a meeting. So that is a lot of the kind of know your rights training that we've been doing. But we know that at the end of the day, workers will feel more comfortable and confident talking about these issues in their workplaces if they have other coworkers with them and they have that strength in numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's all super important. And one last thing I just want to know, is there like a place people can go for resources on if they end up in a situation that you're describing?
Yeah, I think so. If you're not represented by a union, obviously, there are a number of really amazing organizations out there. Palestine Legal is one of them. You can look them up. I'm not sure what their handles are. Obviously, they are completely inundated right now with cases. But if you don't have union representation in your workplace, it's definitely a great resource to reach out to. You can reach out to our organization. Our Twitter handle is Labor Fights Back, @LaborFightsBack. And we have resources on our website just on how to have organizing conversations, some explainer videos on the situation in Israel-Palestine. And you can absolutely get in touch with us if you have any kind of circumstance in your job that you want to kind of work through. We've just been trying our best to really connect workers across industries so that they're not going at this alone, and that we are building a movement across labor in support of the Palestinian people.
Mm-hmm. Nastaran Mohit, U.S. Labor Against Racism and War, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Great. Thanks for having me.